Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our subject tonight and next week is the common or informal fallacies. A fallacy is an invalid form of reasoning. An invalid form of reasoning. In other words, a form of reasoning which does not, in fact, prove the conclusion that it claims to be proving. We call the ones we're going to begin this course with informal fallacies because they are fallacies applicable to all kinds of reasoning, no matter what the particular form of the reasoning. They don't depend on the form of the reasoning, whether it's inductive or deductive, and therefore they are called non-formal or informal fallacies. Now, there's a number of such informal fallacies, over 20. Mostly they have been known for centuries, largely defined by Aristotle himself. Most of them now have Latin names as a result of emerging through the medieval tradition. And it is common for logic courses to begin by discussing these. The purpose is to sharpen the students' reasoning methods and procedures at the very outset by pointing out some of the commonest sorts of errors in reasoning which people commit. The goal is to clear your mental slate in advance, in effect, of a whole host of different types of error, in part to make sure that you yourself recognize them and therefore don't commit them in your own thoughts or statements, and in part to be able to defend yourself in argument against other people who commit them directed toward you. So in effect, this is at the outset an armament of intellectual self-defense. If you really know what these fallacies are, then you can be alert for them, both in the statements of yourself and of others. And if other people commit them, you don't then have to rely just on an uneasy feeling that there's something wrong with what he said, but you don't know specifically what. You can smile in the face of someone committing one of these fallacies. You can see clearly what it is, and you can just look at him and say, oh, that's argumentum ad ignorantiam, that's petitio principii, etc., which has a devastating effect on at least some irrational speech. Aristotle explains the reason for studying common fallacies as follows, quote, if it is a disgrace to a man when he cannot defend himself in a bodily way, it would be odd not to think him disgraced when he cannot defend himself with reason, unquote. So you can think of these as the most general methods, or some of them at least, of intellectual self-defense. Now, a word on how these are classified. No one could classify all the possible kinds of errors and fallacies that human beings engage in, and there would be no point to any such exhaustive classification. So some errors have no particular name, either in English or in Latin. If someone says to you, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, there is no particular fallacy that you can accuse him of. The best thing in such a case is just to say he's crazy. I will give you a couple of miscellaneous grab bag fallacies at the end next week, so that something that doesn't fit into any of the more specific ones will have a slot to go in. But on the whole, we are going to be concerned with the widespread, persuasive, plausible fallacies, the kind that actually take people in. Now, there are a number of different classifications within these fallacies. I will give you a standard one, although various options are possible. And I will take them in no special order, except that I will begin with the one that is undoubtedly the most widespread of all. And I'll give you its Latin name, which is the way you should know it. Argumentum ad veracundiam. Argumentum is just like the English word argument with um added onto it. Ad, A-D, and then veracundiam, V-E-R-E-C-U-N-D-I-A-M. And known to its friends simply as veracundiam. You don't have to keep repeating the argumentum ad. Now, the literal Latin translation is argument or appeal to reverence. That's what veracundia means. Reverence for what? Reverence for the authority of others. Consequently, a general translation would be, this is the fallacy of appeal to authority. And the structure of this fallacy is very simple, no matter how complex the particular cases may become. Other people, one or more, believe X, where X is any idea, thought, proposition. Other people, one or more, believe X, therefore it's true. They say it, therefore it's true. He endorses it, therefore it must be true. Truth is what other people say. Now you understand that it's not a fallacy to learn from other people. There is nothing in this to say that you must originate every element of your mental content without ever acquiring knowledge from other people. If other people teach you something and give you reasons for their beliefs, there is no fallacy of any kind involved in your accepting. And of course you learn an enormous amount from other people, the simplest example of which is 2 + 2 = 4. If you hear the reasons for that and you say, yes, you see it and you accept it, there is no fallacy. Because you're accepting it not simply on the authority of the teacher, but on the fact that you see the reasons, you see the grounds. It becomes a fallacy when the mere fact that other people believe it is considered evidence or proof sufficient unto itself and no reasons are asked for. In other words, when an individual takes over ideas of other people without proof on their authority. Verecundiam, therefore, is the fallacy of the intellectual dependent. Or in objectivist terminology, it is the fallacy par excellence of the social metaphysician. Now, why is this a fallacy? Well, we established the basic reason last week. It's a fallacy because of the primacy of existence. Because existence exists, A is A, facts are what they are, independently of people's ideas, beliefs, viewpoints, and men are fallible. And therefore, the sheer fact that people, one or more, believe a certain idea, that fact alone has no tendency at whatever to establish that it is true, that it corresponds to the actual independent objective fact. You can claim that an idea is true only when you have subjected it to a validating process. And of course, this is the whole reason that we discussed last week why a validating process such as logic is required. Now, in this fallacy, the individual dispenses with a validating process and simply accepts blindly, on faith, whatever pronouncements the relevant others choose to issue. Therefore, this is really a form of mysticism. If you ask the individual, why do you accept what other people say when he commits this fallacy, the ultimate answer is, well, I feel that they know. So it's a kind of a secular supernaturalism in which you get your revelations not allegedly from a supernatural God, but from the Gallup poll. But the mentality and methodology is the same. Now, this fallacy comes in a variety of forms. One prevalent form, and you can think of it, although this is not what it's technically called, it has no special technical name, but I think of it as the quantitative version. And the essence of this form is the appeal to a large number of consciousnesses, a large number of people. In this form of the fallacy, a person will grant that one individual, a few individuals, are obviously fallible and not necessarily authorities. They might be wrong. But if you get a whole bunch of them together, he feels that somehow will be simply irresistible to reality, which will snap into line accordingly. So in this version, it's what you can call a collective subjectivism or a collective primacy of consciousness, with the idea that the consciousness of the authorities determine facts if there's a whole bunch of them. So all of the following, for instance, are examples of this type of verecundia. One Frenchman might be wrong. 10, 15, 20, but 50 million simply can't be wrong. Or a minority might be wrong, but the majority, especially if it's an overwhelming majority, can't be wrong. Or men have been unanimous about this particular point through the course of history. Therefore, it must be true. Or society believes it. Therefore, it must be true. Or this is a matter of our venerable tradition. Tradition being, of course, simply the views accepted by society or large elements thereof across a long period of time in the past. Those are a few of the obvious examples of the quantitative version. Now, most people will recognize when you confront them with this fallacy, the nature of this fallacy, that a group of people are fallible and that their beliefs are not necessarily correct. But you'd be surprised how many people think, if a majority believe it, they say, well, we grant that that doesn't necessarily make it correct. But mustn't there at least be something to it, if a large number of people believe it? Mustn't there be some basis for the view, some probability, at least in favor of the view? Now, the premise behind this interpretation is that most individuals arrive at their beliefs independently, by a study of the facts and a scrupulous assessment of the evidence. And then the person says, well, if all those logical, rational, independent minds concur, isn't there some good chance that there is some actual factual basis for it? Now, the fact is that this is not a valid model to interpret how the majority of people arrive at their views. Most people are very dependent intellectually. They go along with current fashions. They give in to group pressures, in many cases without a qualm. They do not arrive at their views by independent judgment, but by looking to other people and accepting the consensus, the predominant, the fashionable. In other words, they arrive at their views largely by committing the fallacy of verecundiam. And their consensus, therefore, proves nothing whatever about the truth of their views, not even with a degree of probability. You see examples of this all over the place. Take the great majority of the adherents of any one of the religions in the United States today, whether you take it Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish. The overwhelming majority people accept their particular religion, not because they have independently thought out the question, but because that's what their parents taught them, that was the dominant fashion in their particular milieu, and they simply accept it, they're brought up with it, and it becomes part of their content of ideas that they accept, not because of evidence, but simply because of the uncritical acceptance of the intellectual environment they were brought up in. The same is obviously true of politics. If you took a poll in the early United States, when certain ideas were dominant in the country, you would find a huge number of people advocating laissez-faire capitalism. If you took a poll today when a different intellectual atmosphere has been established, ultimately by just a few people, you will find that the great majority of people unquestioningly accept a mixed economy. If you took a poll under Hitler at his height, you would find millions of people who accepted the dogmas of Nazism because they were brought up that way. The best paradigm to keep in mind here is the story of the emperor's clothes. You know, that famous, very profound story, which I won't retell because I trust you know it, but if you see the mechanism by which these people point at the naked emperor, and they don't look at him to see whether he's wearing clothes, but at what everybody else is saying, and they nod, well, the child in that story that said he's naked is the one that refuses to commit verecundiam. If you want another example of this, or two more, take the two most dominant views today intellectually. That would be Christianity and communism. Each of them started with a tiny handful of individuals who were thought to be outlandish, crazy, extremists at the time that they began. And gradually they won a few converts in influential places, and they penetrated the intellectual opinion makers. They began to gain acceptance, and at a certain point, the pressure became irresistible to a great many men, and the masses of people capitulated. Lenin once uttered a very true statement. He wrote a letter some years before the revolution to a friend, and he said, "There are now 7 people who thoroughly understand the philosophy of communism. The success of the revolution is therefore assured." And this is a perfectly valid point. So that if a view is very widespread, particularly an intellectual, philosophical view, the chances are overwhelming that somebody, and originally a very, very few people, perhaps one, was behind it, pushing it, spreading it, and most people were simply not independent enough to resist the tide. So you cannot conclude from widespread acceptance of a view that there is anything to it at all, even 1% of 1% of probability. Now, besides the quantitative version, you can mark down what I call, but again, this is just my own terminology for it, the qualitative version of the same fallacy, argumentum ad verecundiam. In this version, the person selects one or a few individuals or institutions which have attained special prestige for some reason or in some area, and then turns these prestigious individuals or institutions into authorities whom he blindly follows. He says, such and such a great man believes it, therefore it must be true. Such and such a famous man believes it. Such and such a philosopher, a political figure, a military leader, a movie star, a religious leader, etc. Any argument of that form is blatantly verecundiam. President Nixon believes it, therefore it must be true. Betty Grable believes it. Hegel believes it. You can take whatever authority you feel most comfortable with, but the fallacy remains the same. Now, in this connection, I want to point out to you to be very wary of the appeal to, quote, modern science, unquote. A great many people today have the attitude to what they call, quote, modern science. They have an attitude exactly parallel to the attitude many medievals had to the religious hierarchy, namely that modern science is made up of supernatural beings who issue revelations which are unquestionable, and anything uttered by so-called, quote, modern science is therefore infallible. Now, this is false. Scientists are human beings, and they utter an enormous quantity of nonsense along with any other group and profession. The things people accept today in the name of modern science could take a whole lecture by way of revealing the irrationality of them. I remind you, for instance, of the point we made that light is and isn't a wave and is and isn't a particle. There are theories that electrons have free will, uttered by eminent scientists, and that they move, that is to say, electrons from one point to another without traversing the space in between, and a whole raft of such theories, to say nothing of the mentalities that claim that ESP and its equivalents have been proved by modern science. There is no, quote, modern science as a Platonic archetype sitting out there radiating truth. There are only modern scientists. When they report facts of their actual observations, then if they have a basis, you can believe it. But when they come to theorize, then the philosophy of the time influences them just as much as it influences everybody else. If the dominant philosophy is irrational, you can be sure that the scientists will follow in its wake. Scientists are not infallible priests, and if their theories are to be accepted, they must be subjected to the same proof as anybody else's theories. Now, a question is often asked in connection with verecundiam: don't you have to commit it in order to live? Oh, that's asked all the time. People say, what about when you have to rely on the word of experts or specialists, where you must act in some particular emergency, some practical situation, and there's simply no time for you to investigate and acquire first-hand knowledge of your own? Don't you then have to commit the appeal to authority? You go to an architect and he tells you you need such and such for your house. Well, you haven't got time to become an architect. Even such a trivial example as you send your TV to be repaired and he says you need a new bulb. Well, the question goes, simply have to accept what he says. You cannot take off a year and become an expert on TV repair. The classic example of this is you go to a doctor and he tells you you have to have an operation for appendicitis. And I've had any number of students say, well, what can I do? I can't wait 5 years. Will I get an MD? I have to rely on authority. Now, the answer to this question is that there are two entirely different ways of treating experts or specialists. In one way, you definitely do commit this fallacy. In one way, you do not, and it is perfectly proper, logical, and necessary. What is the proper way? Well, it starts by recognizing that the fact that an expert says something by itself, that does not yet prove the truth of anything. Nothing is true just because someone says it. So if you are relying on an expert, you are assuming that he has got good reasons for his statements. And this is something, if you're not to be illogical, this is something you must be able to support with evidence that are available to you. You must have evidence available to you that the expert has good reasons for what he is doing. You must have, in other words, first-hand evidence of the reliability of the expert, that he really does know what he's talking about. And this sort of evidence is possible to you, even if you are not an expert yourself in a given field. Now, if you're choosing a doctor, for instance, not to drag this out at great length, but you would obviously, if you are logical, consider what credentials does he have, what kind of training has he had, what schools did he attend, what experience has he had, what is the state of his practice and how successful is it, and so on. That would be one obvious point. What information can you acquire on your own, establishing the man's credentials? And depending upon the outcome, you will either think there is good reason for trusting this man, or there is not good reason. Now, to give you two extreme examples, if you find, for instance, he's a graduate of Harvard Medical School, assuming that means anything, he has a string of advanced degrees, he's had 20 years of experience in the field, he has a large flourishing practice. So far on this count, that sounds good. As against, for instance, you go to a doctor and you find out that he got his degree by mail order from a Mississippi teacher's college last month. He's had 2 patients so far, both complaining of ingrown toenails, and both died. Now, if you say, well, he's a doctor, he must know, that is verecundiam in such a case. Now, beside the issue of his general credentials, continuing the doctor example, but the same point applies to specialists or experts in general, you must concern yourself with the logic of what he says. An expert should be able to make intelligible to you, in your terms, the general tenor of the reasoning behind his conclusions. Now, obviously, he cannot give you a full proof. Otherwise, you'd have to be an equivalent expert. But he should be able to give you the category of reason, enough to enable you to relate it to what you know on your own. And insofar as he can do this, to that extent, you have further evidence of his reliability. If, on the other hand, for instance, you come with a pain in your right arm and the doctor, no matter what his credential, says we have to amputate your left leg immediately, and if you say, well, he's a doctor, he must know, that is verecundiam. But assume that his recommendations are intelligible to you, they make sense, then to that extent, that is further evidence that you have, that he is reliable. And of course, you are obligated to continue to think on each new occasion. Continue to judge by whether what he says makes sense to you, by the nature of the results, call in consultation of other experts if you have doubts. If you follow this procedure, then you are to that extent equipping yourself with evidence so that you are not simply blindly accepting what he says, but doing so on the basis of evidence. Now, in order not to commit the fallacy of verecundiam, however, you must identify the exact status of the conclusion you are entitled to come to. In most cases where you rely on experts, you yourself personally cannot claim to be absolutely certain that what he is saying is true, because after all, you do not know all of the facts firsthand. I would not dogmatize on this point. I believe there are certain cases where a non-expert can be absolutely certain. If it's a comparatively non-complex case, such as the doctor prescribes a certain treatment of ingrown toenail, I don't think there is much, if any, element of doubt about the appropriate treatment. But in a great many cases, you cannot claim to be completely certain yourself. What you can do, however, is attain a high degree of rational probability. You can say, on the basis of the evidence available to me, it is highly probable that this man is correct, and I must act, and therefore this is what I'm going to do. In such a case, if you identify the exact status of the conclusion you're coming to, you are sticking with the evidence available to you. You're not claiming a conclusion that goes beyond what you firsthand know. You are still being intellectually independent. You are not committing verecundia. Now, of course, a corollary of this point on specialists is that a specialist, even with all the credentials and so on in the world, is a specialist in his own field only. When a doctor starts to pontificate on metaphysics, or a physicist on politics, he immediately loses any credentials and status that he had as an authority and is converted to the most ordinary man on the street, where his statements have to be judged by the perfectly normal means. Now we can apply all of these points in regard to experts briefly to the issue of witnesses. Another question frequently asked, you see, in connection with verecundiam is it verecundiam to rely on the testimony of others in regard to facts that they claim they observed? We're not speaking here of experts now, but plain ordinary people who says, I saw such and such, which you yourself, let us say, did not see. That's what we call the issue of the witnesses. Is it verecundiam? Because after all, most of history, most of geography, the vast majority of what you get out of the newspapers and so on, is ultimately a product of witnesses, and it's not material that you have firsthand observed. Now, the proper policy in regard to witnesses is exactly parallel to the proper policy in regard to experts. It is not verecundiam to rely on a witness if you are independent in judging the witness's reliability and the nature of what he reports. And in a great many cases in regard to witnesses, you can be absolutely certain of some fact, even if you never saw it yourself firsthand. And here, there are two general points to make. First, the issue of the veracity or reliability of the witness. If you know anything which undermines the veracity or reliability of the witness, then, of course, his testimony collapses. It's of no value. If you know he has an axe to grind, he's motivated by some ulterior purpose, he has a record of dishonesty, etc., then, of course, he is disqualified, and you don't have to pay any attention whatever, in fact, logically should not, to the reports of facts that he claims to have observed. If, for instance, a communist reporter returns from a trip to the Soviet Union and tells you about the glowing conditions that he observed there, then you simply throw that out as worthless, prejudiced. You know the conditions of who gets into the Soviet Union or what they're allowed to observe and so on. You simply say that's the product of intellectual gangsterism and dismiss it. Or to switch the example, a man with a record of perjury, a policy of lying on major issues when he chooses. Such a man's testimony on all points is worthless, because a policy of lying implies that there are circumstances where he puts something above the facts of reality. And if so, he is not trustworthy on any point thereafter, because you never know when he is or isn't doing it. On the other hand, a man with a record of impeccable veracity and responsibility, there is correspondingly much greater weight to his testimony. Now, a second criterion in regard to witnesses is the actual nature of what they report that they've observed. Is the content of their report credible? Is it self-consistent? Can you integrate it without contradiction into the things you already know? Is there any other evidence that you know which supports it, tends to confirm it, or which detracts from it and argues against it? Now, of course, the witness may report something surprising that you hadn't thought of. For instance, the discovery of radioactivity. So we're not here saying it's got to be boringly familiar. What you must be able to do is integrate the report without contradiction into the sum of what you already do know. I'll give you two extreme examples. On the one hand, a man tells you that there is a country called China. Now, you've never seen it. And a great many people say, well, that's verecundiam. For you to accept the existence of China, you've never been there, that's simply faith. Now, of course, this is ridiculous. It is absolutely certain that there is such a place. And this you know simply from the nature of the evidence available to you, even if you've never been there. You know that there are a great many countries, and therefore one more here or there doesn't raise any metaphysical hell, so to speak. You know the Chinese language and have undoubtedly seen specimen of it. You've seen Orientals, you've read countless reports in newspapers, etc. There is no possibility that this is all a giant conspiracy to hoodwink you. You can be certain that there is a China simply by the massive integration of evidence pointing consistently to it. It integrates completely with what you know firsthand, and there is no counter-evidence. Now, on the other hand, suppose a man says he was walking down the Hudson River the other day and he saw a man walk on the water. And you say, oh, you mean on water skis? And he says, no, he was just walking on the water with his bare feet and it wasn't frozen. And then he bent over to a rock and tapped it and out gushed Coca-Cola. Not because there was a complex system of pulleys inside, but simply miraculously the rock turned into Coca-Cola. You say, by metaphysical principle alone, that miracles cannot occur and that entities cannot act in contradiction to their nature and the laws of nature. These events could not have taken place, no matter how many people swear that they observed them. To summarize, so long as the witness is reliable, he has no history of lying or perjury or prejudice, and the facts are logically integratable without contradiction into the sum of what you know, it is not a fallacy to accept the testimony of witnesses. And in a great number of cases, as I say, you can be certain. It's a fallacy when you ignore one or both of these points and trust a witness just because he said something, apart from the issue of his reliability and or of the logic of what he actually reports. Now, a few final points on verecundiam in general. There is one device that some people use to gain acceptance of a point, which is an indirect version of verecundiam, which is called the use of prestige jargon. Prestige jargon. In this case, the individual, instead of stating his point simply and straightforwardly, clothes it in impressive, fancy, polysyllabic, excessively complicated language, with the idea that he will cow you into submission by his actual choice of terminology. He is hoping to make you feel, the guy who talks like this must know what he's talking about, and therefore I will capitulate and accept on his authority. So it's really an attempt to inculcate reverence for authority in you via the means of complex language. And the only way out of this is, if you're confronted with one of these specimens, you must demand self-righteously a translation into truck driver's English. You must tell him you know no words longer than a truck driver knows, and you want to hear his point put in plain, blunt, crude, simple terms. Now, of course, if it's a technical subject, it may not be possible for him to do it. But if it's within the realm of philosophy, ideology, politics, religion, and so on, it is possible to speak plainly. The person who uses prestige jargon is, in Nietzsche's famous phrase, muddying his waters to make them appear deep. And when you clear away the mud, you usually see there's nothing there. Now, you can do this with the most innocuous thoughts. For instance, I'll give you a prestige jargon statement, and you tell me what elementary observation this is clothing. A nomadic portion of the metamorphosed igneous or sedimentary deposit of the Proterozoic era accumulates no bryophytic plant life. Now, that's a rolling stone gathers no moss. And it doesn't become any more profound or true by being put that way. Advertisements frequently make use of this. There was one, I recall offhand some years ago, that used some toothpaste that used to say that it has GL70, not 69 or 71, but GL70, with no further explanation. That's obvious attempt to convey this is something scientific by the use of the language. Perhaps the champion in this respect is Immanuel Kant in the use of prestige jargon. One last point, and then we'll leave verecundiam, and that is, do not be awed by the manner of a speaker. A good speaker can often communicate a contagious sense of confidence in the truth of what he is saying, and take the easily awed or the unwary in by the use of gestures, intonations, pauses, the obvious projection of assurance. The person listening will feel, well, he must know what he is saying, and will be taken in by the manner rather than the factual content. Whereas if the exact same content were presented in a halting, timorous, uncertain, unsure way, the individual would think, well, there's nothing much to that. It's not so impressive. Now you have to train yourself, if you're to avoid verecundiam, to focus only on the logic of what the individual says, on the question, does he offer arguments? So that if you heard the same content in a brilliantly oratorical fashion and a stumblingly halting, doubtful fashion, you would have the exact same logical estimate. Now, of course, I don't mean that there's anything wrong with being confident or projecting confidence. The point is only don't be taken in by a manner as a substitute for argument. All right, number 2, and this will be much more brief because much more obvious. Argumentum ad baculum. B-A-C-U-L-U-M. Argumentum ad baculum. Now, baculum is literally Latin for walking stick. Can you guess what the appeal to the walking stick is? Well, the structure of this argument, to give you a colloquial version of it first, is X is true. Why? Because I'll bash your teeth in if you don't accept it. This is the appeal to physical force or violence or a threat of a harm of some kind in order to induce acceptance of an idea. The appeal to physical force or violence or the threat of harm of some kind to induce acceptance of an idea. And, of course, the slogan that encapsulates this fallacy is might makes right. Any attempt to force your views on others by means of duress or threat as against logical persuasion would be an example of this fallacy. And why it's a fallacy, I think, is obvious. Reason and force are opposites. Violence, threats prove nothing whatever, and in fact they simply represent a complete abdication of logic, of argument, a confession of intellectual bankruptcy, and reversion to the level, a subhuman animal level. Another classic example and refutation of this fallacy is Galileo and the Inquisition. You know that Galileo held that the earth moves. The Inquisition demanded that he recant. He did formally recant, which he was, of course, perfectly justified in doing from the point of view of self-preservation. But it is recorded that when he left, he whispered quietly to himself as he was departing, "But it still does move." And of course, that is just the point. No amount of threats, violence, or force will alter the fact. Might does not make right. All the brainwashing in totalitarian dictatorships, all those show trials which result from it, are large-scale examples of baculum, because they represent the attempt to convert the victim, to make him accept ideas under the threat, or in many cases, the actuality of physical torture. Now in this country, the cruder statists and many religionists sometimes use baculum. For instance, I've heard this kind of discussion. You will ask a given person, is this law right? Is it proper? And he'll say, obviously, you'll go to jail if you disobey it. Well, that is completely irrelevant. Is the law true? Perhaps you're legally required to obey it, but to dangle a threat before your eyes to induce your agreement with the content of the law is obviously baculum. Religionists have their own version of this. If you don't believe in God, you'll go to hell. Now, that, you see, is simply a supernatural version. You could think of that as a kind of otherworldly or divine baculum. All those power and lib movements are the great majority of them. The student power, black power, fat lib, gay lib, the whole crew of them, on the whole, are classic representatives of this type of fallacy, because their typical tactic is to make some claim. Instead of providing argument for it, threaten. Force, riots, bombing, violence, destruction, etc., as against arguing for their proposals, and then simply count on fear, appeasement on the part of the group they're trying to extract something from in order to gain agreement. This is absolute brute irrationalism. Now, it need not, to be baculum, be a direct, blatant physical threat. For instance, a union may say to an employer, our workers are entitled to X dollars more per week. And the employer says, give us your reason, and the answer is because we'll go out on strike if you don't. Now, they may have a perfect right in certain circumstances to go out on strike, but the logical point here is the threat to strike is not an argument in favor of a certain wage scale. It simply is a threat, and as such is baculum. Or if you want to conclude on a homey example, a wife asks her husband for a trip to Hawaii, and he says, what is your reason? And she says, because I won't cook anymore if you don't. That is a homey little case of baculum. Number 3. Argumentum ad hominem. H-O-M-I-N-E-M. Now, number 4 is also going to be called argumentum ad hominem, but it'll be a different subdivision. So this one you can call argumentum ad hominem, parenthesis, abusive. Abusive, as against another variety we'll look at in a moment. A very well-known, very widespread fallacy, which means literally the appeal to the man. In this fallacy, the individual attempts to disprove some idea, to disprove an idea, not by attacking the argument put forth for it, but by attacking the advocate of the idea. In this fallacy, to repeat, an individual attempts to disprove an idea, not by attacking the argument or the idea itself, but by attacking somebody who advocates it. He tries to blacken the advocate of the idea rather than impugn his viewpoint. He engages, as we say, in personalities, which is obviously irrelevant. The truth or falsehood of an idea and an argument depends on facts and logic, not on the characteristics of the person who puts it forth. You can think of this as simply the reverse of verecundiam. In verecundiam, you say, he or they say it, therefore it's true. In ad hominem, you say, he or they say it, therefore it's false. In either case, you're not looking at the facts, but at the speaker. Then if you like or feel off for one speaker, you let that take over in verecundiam. If you dislike or feel repugnance, you let that take over and it's ad hominem. Now the point of attack can be anything. You can attack an individual's sex. You're a man, you can't understand. You're a woman, you can't understand. That latter, by the way, is not called ad feminem, just it's regarded as ad hominem. You can attack age. You're young, you'll learn. You're old, you won't, etc. Financial status, you're rich, you're poor. Occupational status, you're an employer, an employee. your management, you're wicked, you're labor, you're corrupt, etc. The person's political party, his religion, his personal character, he's mean, he's conceited, he's immoral, he eats babies for breakfast, all of that. Now, a famous example of this is in connection with the philosopher Nietzsche. Many philosophers have noted that when they teach Nietzsche's ethics in class, Nietzsche was, of course, a staunch opponent of altruism, and he gave various arguments of uneven quality, but nevertheless against altruism. And usually introductory classes find this very disconcerting because they cannot answer his arguments, and yet it threatens the ethics that they have come to accept. And at some point, almost without fail, some student will discover that in 1889 Nietzsche went formally insane and was insane for the rest of his life, at which point he will tell that to the rest of the class, who will breathe a collective sigh of relief. Now they don't have to answer the argument because Nietzsche was crazy. Now, of course, you see that is ad hominem and completely irrelevant. If an argument is given for a view, it makes no difference what the source is. If a man in the looniest ward of Bellevue calls out the window that 2 and 2 equals 4, you don't say, well, he's crazy, therefore he must be wrong. Now, it's very common to attack the time when someone lived as against answering his argument. That is also ad hominem. You've heard, for instance, this type of argument. The American Constitution must be no good because its authors lived in the 18th century and we are now living in the 20th century, so obviously it couldn't be any good anymore. Now that is ad hominem, attacking something about the man as against the content. Now, you could construct a quite different type of argument. It wouldn't be valid in this case, I don't think. In fact, I know. But just as an example, you could say such and such a view was put forth in the 18th century. Since that time, the following conditions have changed. Therefore, the conclusion that was valid then is not applicable now. That would not be ad hominem and would have to be judged on its merits. But if you simply say time has passed, the people who advocated this are old, they're hundreds of years gone, therefore we can dispense with their viewpoint, that is ad hominem. Now, perhaps the commonest form of this fallacy is to psychologize your opponent rather than to consider his argument. There is a very bad tendency on the part of many people simply to ignore, to pay no attention to the actual arguments that people put forth in favor of a view. And as soon as they hear a view with which they disagree, to begin to hypothesize what could possibly have motivated such and such a person to put this view forth. Now, this approach is dead wrong if the question at issue is the viewpoint correct? You have to make a sharp separation in your mind between psychology and logical analysis. There's nothing more futile than two people psychologizing each other and ignoring the question of fact and logic. You've all heard, I'm sure, arguments about God, in which the religious one says to the other, oh, don't give me those arguments. You don't believe in God because you had a cruel father and you're simply rebelling against all authority. And the guy answers back, oh, you claim to have arguments, but the truth is that you simply are a dependent who needs cosmic protection, and that's really what makes you go for God. Now, this is entirely irrelevant, this question of motivation, to the question, is there a God or not? A question which only logic can decide. Psychologizing, if you engage in it at all, has got to come only after you establish the truth or falsehood of a viewpoint, and as a completely independent subject from the question of the truth or falsity of the viewpoint. First, you establish by logical means that a given idea is true or false. And then, if it's so false that it can't be a simple error, you might want to ask, well, what kind of psychology could have dreamed this up? But you must never mix the two. Now, there are many schools today, philosophic, psychological, political schools, extremely guilty of this fallacy. I think offhand of the Marxists and the Freudians. both of whom in different ways elevate ad hominem into a whole philosophic system. Declare it's not possible for anybody to be objective. You are, according to one version, simply a helpless product of your economic environment, according to the other, of your id plus its various associates. And therefore, in either case, you don't really believe what you're saying for the reasons you think. That's all empty rationalization. And the real thing moving you is your bourgeois parents or your cannibalistic lust to, what, eat your mother. And therefore, we can ignore arguments and simply point out the hidden factors behind you. Now, this is a full-scale, systematized, institutionalized ad hominem, which is, of course, obviously self-defeating in character, because if everyone is subjectively conditioned by their economic environment, so are the Marxists, who then lose all claim to objectivity, and the same with the Freudians, who are then simply spewing what their id requires, and it has no more claim to objectivity than any other viewpoint. It's sometimes called the tu quoque technique, T-U-Q-U-O-Q-U-E, which simply is prestige jargon Latin for you too. And it's a useless technique of arguing, but it simply exposes the uselessness of ad hominem. Now, I'd like to point out that there is nothing whatever wrong with attacking a man or attacking his character. Please do not draw from this the moral that I am preaching universal love or Christianity or any such thing. It can be perfectly logical to launch a devastating, all-out assault against a man and declare every kind of vice that he possesses if you can prove it. The only time it becomes a fallacy is if you attack him in place of answering his argument. If you use the attack to enable you to bypass what he says. But if the subject under discussion is a certain man good or evil, and you can support your view by argument, it is perfectly logical to go ahead and do so, and there's nothing in logic that says you have to love everybody. Now, briefly, there's one case just before we leave this fallacy where people sometimes think that ad hominem is being committed when in fact it isn't. This again pertains to witnesses, but in a different connection. Suppose a man on the witness stand who is a convicted perjurer with a history of lying, and you therefore say he's unreliable and you dismiss his testimony. It's sometimes asked, well, is this ad hominem? Are you saying he's a liar, therefore what he says is false? Now here you have to distinguish between a witness on a stand giving an argument from a man giving a report of observed facts, facts that he claims that he observed. As far as giving an argument is concerned, his veracity is irrelevant. He may be the worst perjurer in history, but if he stands there on the stand and he says all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is immortal, that argument stands on its own merits, independent of his reliability. So the question really arises only if he claims an observed fact, a fact that you have no independent way of verifying, no way apart from his testimony. Now, in such a case, if he is a perjurer, it is logical to dismiss his account. Why? You are not saying in such a case, he is bad, he's a liar, therefore whatever he says is false. If you reason that way, that would be the fallacy of ad hominem, because after all, liars can tell the truth sometimes. Your proper reasoning in dismissing such testimony is the following. He's unreliable. Therefore, his assertion of this point is worthless as far as evidence is concerned. If there's other evidence, you listen, and you judge according to the weight of the evidence. But if there's no other evidence, suppose, and his statement is worthless, then you are in the position that you have no evidence at all for the point. And in that situation, the relevant principle is the onus of proof is on him who asserts that a fact is so, a principle which I will expound later this evening in connection with another fallacy. But in this issue, the point is you would be dismissing it, not because a liar says it, but because there is no evidence at all to support it. The fact that he is a liar is relevant only insofar as it discredits his testimony from serving as evidence. So it's not ad hominem to dismiss the testimony of an unreliable witness. Ad hominem would be, he says it, and that makes it false. And that, of course, is fallacious. Number 4. This is another variety of argumentum ad hominem, but it's called argumentum ad hominem circumstantial, as against abusive. See, the first was called abusive because you abuse the person. But here, as you'll see in a special way, you appeal to his special circumstances, a very defined, specific type of circumstance. Now, in this version, you try to refute a belief, not by showing that it's objectively false, but by appealing to the other beliefs of some particular individual. The other beliefs of some particular individual. You argue, he personally cannot accept this belief because otherwise he will be being inconsistent with other ideas he holds. Let's get an example before us. The classic example is the fundamentalist clergyman, that is to say, someone who takes the literal interpretation of Scripture. And you're talking to such a clergyman, let us say, and the issue of the Darwinian theory of evolution arises. And if you were to say to him, you, this clergyman, have to agree with me that the Darwinian theory is wrong. I've proved it. And my proof is, you are a fundamentalist. Therefore, it contradicts the tenets of the Bible, and you can't accept it. Let's assume here that there really is an incompatibility between Darwinism and fundamentalism. Now, in this case, the person is trying to induce a rejection of Darwinism, not by pointing to any alleged errors of Darwinism, but by appealing to the man, ad hominem, to his special circumstances. In other words, his other beliefs. That's why it's called circumstantial ad hominem. The person is arguing that to avoid personal inconsistency, the clergyman must simply agree that Darwinism is wrong. Now it's a little trickier to state what is the fallacy here. To begin with, there is obviously nothing wrong with pointing out contradictions in a person's views. That is indispensable to logic. Where then is the fallacy? The fallacy doesn't consist of pointing out a contradiction, but of using the inconsistency to establish the falsehood of one of the opinions, to get the man to reject one specific side of the contradiction, when all we know, given a contradiction, is that one side is true and the other is false, but we do not yet know which is the true one and which is the false one. For instance, in this case, if a man combines fundamentalism and Darwinism, you know that both can't be true. But that, of course, does not yet establish which one is true. Maybe the Darwinism is correct and the fundamentalism is wrong. Or, as a matter of fact, in this example, both might be wrong because they're not exact contradictory. If you assume that just because a new point contradicts an old belief, therefore the new point by that fact alone is wrong, you are committing this fallacy. In the face of a contradiction, all you know is that at least one of the views is wrong. But it is not necessarily the latest view. Maybe an old belief was wrong. And of course, the issue has to be decided by the evidence for or against the respective views. I'll give you another example. You say to a man, you must agree with me that that particular measure in favor of laissez-faire capitalism is false, invalid, wrong. What's the argument? You answer, well, you're a Democrat with a capital D, and this contradicts the Democratic Party platform. Now here again, he's not attempting to show that the laissez-faire measure is objectively wrong. He is invoking the issue of personal consistency and telling the man, on pain of being contradictory to what earlier ideas you accepted, you must reject this particular one. Now, if objective truth is our concern, it doesn't follow. From the fact of a contradiction, you know that one or the other must be right, but not yet which one. One more simple example of this. Suppose I criticize a student for coming late to class, and I give him an argument why it's wrong to be late. And he says, who are you to talk? You were late yourself last week, so lateness must be okay, and I've proved the validity of coming late. Now, the fact that my actions contradict my stated views definitely shows that I'm in trouble. But it does not show that my argument against lateness was wrong. It shows only that one of those two positions is wrong, because there's a contradiction. And in this case, obviously, it was my own violation of the principle that was wrong, not my argument for being on time. So in general, to sum up this one, it is valid and valuable to point out contradictions. But if you argue with someone and try to induce acceptance, not by proving a given view, but simply by accepting without question his previous beliefs and trying to get him to agree on grounds of personal inconsistency, you are establishing nothing objectively. You are appealing to the special ideological circumstances of the man, not to objective fact. And that's why it's called circumstantial ad hominem. All right, let us turn now to a series of appeals to emotion. Now, the ones we've covered so far, in a sense, indirectly were appeals to emotion, to reverence and offer authority in the case of verecundia, to fear of threats or force in the case of vacuum, to antagonism or hostility to a given man in the case of ad hominem. But now we have several which involve a more direct, specific, naked appeal to emotion. And let us then turn to number 5, which has no Latin name. It's simply called the appeal to one's own emotion. The appeal to one's own emotion. Now this one, I think, should be obvious in the light of what we said last week. The structure of this fallacy is, I feel that such and such is true or false, therefore it is. A certain feeling is present in my breast, that proves or disproves the idea in question. The title of it is self-explanatory. My own emotion is the standard. It makes me happy to believe that my business will prosper, therefore it will. I feel strongly, let us say some young woman says, I feel strongly that some wonderful man will fall in love with me while I sit at home and watch television. Therefore he will. I love her, therefore she must be good, which is a transference from I have a certain feeling, therefore a certain fact must exist. I can't bear to believe there'll be a dictatorship in America, therefore there won't be, etc. Now, all these are examples of appealing to your own emotion as proof of some point or fact. Now, why this is a fallacy will be obvious, I think, on the basis of what we said last week. Emotions are not tools of cognition. They are not instruments of knowledge. The fact that you feel something proves nothing except that you hold certain values and ideas. But it doesn't prove that those values and ideas correspond to reality. A is A. Existence exists independent of anyone's feelings. Now you can commit this fallacy with all sorts of different feelings, depending upon how devious a person is. It doesn't have to be blatant cases of desire. It can be fear, love, hate, yearning, titillation, vanity, you name it. Take an indirect form in which the individual appeals to fear. He's at a party. There's a group of people discussing the question of God, and they are devout believers. He feels frightened by this fact. He raises in his mind the question, well, should he speak up? Let's assume it was appropriate. Should he speak up and say he doesn't believe in God, he is an atheist, supposing that he is? And he feels a strong fear, no, he doesn't want to. Now, the actual structure in such a case might be, I feel fear, Therefore, it is undesirable to take this action. But if you said it that way, it would be too blatantly an appeal to his own emotion. And so what many people will do in such a case is rationalize. Invent fancy reasons why there's really no use speaking, when what actually moves them is not the reasons they invent, but a particular emotion, in this case, fear. So he might say, oh, well, what's the use of stating your view to other people? They're all hopeless and you can't get anywhere by speaking to them anyway, and therefore I won't speak. Now, if he actually believes that and it's appropriate in a particular case, that's one thing. But if the actual structure of his reasoning is, I feel fear, therefore this action is wrong, only he simply covers it up, that is the fallacy of appealing to one's own emotion. Now, the greatest violators or committers of this fallacy, of course, are the mystics and the subjectivists that we discussed last week. Mysticism is explicitly the appeal to feelings as tools of cognition. Subjectivism comes to the view that feelings shape and create facts. I think we covered that amply last week. This, however, I should say, just as we leave it, is an enormously widespread fallacy. Let's do one more before the break. This one represents an attempt to appeal not to your own emotions, but to other people's emotions. And it has a Latin name. It should be number 6, right? Argumentum ad populum. P-O-P-U-L-U-M. Argumentum ad populum. Which literally translates, appeal to the people, the gallery, the crowd, the mob. This is the attempt to induce acceptance of a point or rejection by stirring up the feelings, the emotions, the passions of your audience, of other people. Attempting to appeal to enthusiasms, likes, hates, and so on, of your listener in the absence of rational argument. Now, the classic example of this is, of course, the rabble-rouser, the demagogue, who tries to inflame his audience emotions, playing on their prejudices, whipping them up into a frenzy, counting on them to abandon logic and thought and argument in the heat of the unleashed passions of the moment. Adolf Hitler, of course, was a master of this, but unfortunately it was not restricted to Germany, and you could cite many American politicians in this connection. Let us take one brief historical example. William Jennings Bryan was famous for using this technique. If you know about his various debates in connection with the issue, should there be a gold standard, to which he was opposed, here's a brief excerpt from one of his speeches. Quote, you have to say this with the appropriate oratorical flourishes and the hair flying and the arms outstretched and so on. Quote, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold, unquote, etc., etc. Now, you see, there is no content there at all. All he is saying is, don't do it, it's bad. Not why, not what the alternative is, etc. It's a highly emotional appeal, substituting for any factual content or argument. Now, a certain amount of advertising obviously commits this fallacy. Certain types of advertisers try to arouse and play on emotional associations with their product, so that instead of trying to give you something in the nature of the product that would be a reason to buy it, they try to associate it with beautiful girls, sexual success, stirring music, social prestige. In other words, try to arouse favorable emotion rather than give you some kind of reason. That is populum. I've even heard a reverse twist of that. Somebody told me once that some advertising agency had the theory that the thing to do is deliberately antagonize the consumer. Make the commercial so raucous, so blatant, so mindless, so stupid, that the audience will swear they'll never buy this product by the mechanism of antagonism. And then their reasoning according to what I was told, is the housewife then goes to the supermarket and there are 40 different brands that you can't tell one from the other, but aha, she remembers the one she hated, and so she buys it. Now that's a reverse populum, you see, but it's still populum. It's still trying to induce action on the basis of emotion rather than on argument or the quality of the product. I have grave reservations or doubts as to whether that one would work at all, but I mention it just to broaden your perspective on this fallacy. Now, many of the commonest techniques of populum are obvious: shouting, declamation, arm waving, frenzied gestures, etc. But one in particular is worth commenting on briefly, and that is the use of what is called emotive language. Emotive language, which just means emotional language. An emotive term is one which, over and above its factual meaning, has a certain emotional overtone or connotation, and which serves to call up the equivalent emotion in the mind of the listener. The emotion might be positive or negative. And it is true that the same fact can often be described in emotive terms or in neutral, unemotional terms, and that the impact is definitely different. For instance, you go into a restaurant and you see filet mignon, $10.50, and you pay it. But suppose you went in and you see essentially the same content, but the menu says, hunk of dead cow. Now that obviously changes the price. Now you can make up a whole list of words with different emotional significance for the essential same content. If the content you want to communicate, for instance, is female adult, human being, you can say woman, babe, broad, dame, lady, floozy, frail, chick, Jane, tomato, belle, and it goes on and on. And they obviously have a whole gamut of different emotional associations. Suppose the factual content you want to communicate is simply he became psychotic. He went mad, he cracked up, went insane, he acquired a mental disorder, he became maladjusted, he turned into a loony. So we have eggheads and intellectuals, newfangled schemes, progressive innovations, advertising executive, hucksters, sanitation inspector, guy who picks up garbage, etc. Now it is clear that the use of certain terminology adds emotional overtones, positive or negative, and can alter the listener's response to the same fact. Now, I must take a moment to read you an example worked out by one logician to illustrate this point. He took a piece of poetry, just 2 lines, and rewrote it using non-emotive terms. He took 2 lines from Keats' The Eve of St. Agnes. And I'll read you first the 2 lines as they appear in the original. Full on this casement shone the wintry moon, and threw warm jewels on Madeline's fair breast. Now here's his analysis. Casement means simply a kind of window with emotional and romantic associations. Jewels is the heraldic name for red, the color red, with a suggestion of romance which accompanies all heraldry. Madeline is simply a girl's name, but one calling out favorable emotions, absent from a relatively plain and straightforward name. Fair simply means an objective fact that her skin was white or uncolored, a necessary condition for the colors of the window to show. But also, fair implies warm emotional preference for an uncolored skin rather than one which is yellow, purple, etc., or any of the other colors that skin might be. Breast also has similar emotional meanings, and the aim of scientific description might have been equally well attained if it had been replaced by such a neutral word as chest. Let us now try the experiment of keeping these 2 lines in a metrical form, but replacing all the emotionally colored words by neutral ones, while making as few other changes as possible. We may write, full on this window shone the wintry moon, making red marks on Jane's uncolored chest. Now, the factual content remains essentially the same there, but obviously it has a vastly different emotive impact. Now, there is nothing fallacious in the use of emotional language as such. It is perfectly valid. So when does it become a form of ad populum? When does it become fallacious? Only when the emotion replaces argument. And you must make a sharp distinction here between emotion accompanying argument and emotion substituting for argument. In the first case, you are being perfectly logical. I want to stress this. To be logical does not mean being dry, uninspired, dead, bored, or boring. You can be violent, colorful, passionate, inflamed, intense, and use emotive language all over the place. But the crucial point is the emotional language an adjunct to the content of your argument? Do you give arguments which earn for you the right to those emotional language? It's when you use emotively tinged words to invoke emotional acceptance in the absence of argument that you are committing the fallacy of populum. And of course, this is all over the place today and has been for years in American political discussions. Oh, think, for instance, of the war on poverty, which is an emotive label for an old-fashioned giveaway scheme hoping to cash in on Christian feeling. Or think, for instance, of the public good, which is a magic, positively tinged emotive phrase given no definition by the great majority of the people who use it, simply a signal to invoke automatic approval and inhibit argument. Well, I think you can see that all over the place. Let us take our break at this point. Let us pick up with the fallacies that involve direct emotional appeals, and one more, a specific type of appeal to emotion. In a way, it's a subdivision of ad populum. You're trying to play on the emotions of others. But it received a particular name because it is so common. This is the argumentum ad misericordiam. Misericordiam. M-I-S-E-R-I-C-O-R-D-I-A-M. Argumentum ad misericordiam. Misericordia means pity, and this, therefore, is the appeal to pity. It is the fallacy in which the individual attempts to invoke pity, compassion, make the other person, a group of people, feel sorry, and thereby gain undeserved acceptance, logically undeserved, of some particular point. This you can think of as the hearts and flowers fallacy. The idea is to get the audience to cry or its equivalent, and then float them into acceptance of a point on the tears rather than on the reasoning. Now, Mark Antony's funeral oration in Julius Caesar is the classic example of this. And the question at issue was Caesar attempting to become a dictator? And Antony spoke to the assembled mob, and the content of his speech was, look how he suffered. Look at his wounds. Brutus was his friend, and here the poor man was betrayed, etc. Needless to say, it doesn't work unless you do it more eloquently than that, than the way I've just summarized it, but that was the essential content. The idea is to stir them up to agree that Caesar had a bad deal, and therefore to accept the idea that he wasn't an aspiring dictator. Yet there was no argument. Essentially, it was merely an appeal to pity. Here is an example taken from a noted American user of this fallacy, Clarence Darrow. Now, he was defending a gentleman named Thomas Kidd, an officer of the Amalgamated Woodworkers Union, who was indicted on a charge of criminal conspiracy. Here's an excerpt from Darrow's speech to the jury. Quote, I appeal to you not for Thomas Kidd, but I appeal to you for the long line The long, long line reaching back through the ages and forward to the years to come. The long line of despoiled and downtrodden people of the earth. I appeal to you for those men who rise in the morning before daylight comes, and to go home at night when the light has faded from the sky, and give their life, their strength, their toil to make others rich and great. I appeal to you in the name of those women who are offering up their lives to this modern god of gold, and I appeal to you in the name of those little children, the living and the unborn, etc. Now, that's a blatant appeal to pity. Now, this fallacy is everywhere today because it is fundamental to the whole altruistic ethics, which in a way simply translates this fallacy into a moral code. The whole play and emphasis on need as against justice and what does a man rightfully deserve. The whole approach of feel sorry for him, it's your duty to serve him, morality consists of relieving his pain, etc. In that kind of moral atmosphere, you can see that misericordiam, the appeal to pity, would be rife. You see it as one obvious example in the case of the arguments put forth by many defenders of juvenile delinquents and assorted criminals. They plead for the release or the mitigation of sentence, not on grounds pertaining to the facts of the case, but on the grounds he couldn't help it. His father drank, his mother drank, his brother-in-law did this, etc. Feel sorry for them. They're victims of society. They couldn't help it. Therefore, they didn't do it, or they deserve a lighter sentence. That is blatantly the appeal to pity. Or, one last example, because this is an obvious fallacy. An employee asks for a raise, not on the grounds of the quality of his work, the value of his product, factual considerations of that kind, but I have 3 children that depend upon me, and they all have polio, and my brother-in-law has this disease, and my mother-in-law was just run over. That whole business is argumentum ad misericordiam. All right, let us go on to number, 8. Now, this is the last argumentum ad. Argumentum ad ignorantiam. 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 Now, this is no longer an emotional appeal. This is a very important fallacy, and more complex than any we have discussed so far. And before I explain what the nature of this fallacy is, I want to give an example at the outset. And the best way to do this is point to someone, for instance, you. And I will make a statement about you. I'll say that within the last 2 weeks, you committed a particularly gory murder. Now, I put this forth as an arbitrary assertion. Remember what we mean by arbitrary? Something backed with no evidence, no proof. Simply a caprice, a wanton bolt from the blue based on nothing. Now remember, that's what we mean by arbitrary. Now I make this charge about this lady. I say, you committed a very gory murder in the last 2 weeks. I don't give any argument in favor, but I say, prove that you did not do it. Disprove this claim on my part. Now the fact is, as I'll show you in a moment, she cannot do it. Nobody can disprove such a charge. So long as I put it forth arbitrarily, and I am free to continue to make arbitrary assertions. So long as I am free to make arbitrary, baseless, gratuitous assertions, it is impossible to prove that my original claim was false. For instance, I say she committed the murder. She says, oh, I can refute that. For the last 2 weeks, that's when you say the murder was committed, I had witnesses with me every single night, and I can produce the witnesses. To which I come back and say, well, witnesses can be bribed. I claim you bribed those witnesses. Prove that you didn't. You say to me, well, all right, I'll do it from another point of view. Where's the corpse? How can you claim I committed a murder if there's no corpse? I say you dissolved the corpse in acid. So obviously it doesn't exist. Prove that you didn't. You say to me, well, look, I'll give you the most powerful argument. The murder took place in Australia. And I was in a hospital in Manhattan in a plaster cast for the whole 2 weeks. Now, is that a refutation or not? And I say, it doesn't prove a thing. Obviously, what you did is you hired a consummate actor, a stand-in, made her up like you, got her into the hospital in a plaster cast, went off to Australia, committed the murder, rushed back, changed places, under cover of secrecy, so obviously that doesn't disprove my claim. Now prove that you didn't do it. Now it should be obvious to you that she cannot prove that she didn't do it if I am free to make arbitrary claims. It is impossible. Well, if I say from that, you can't disprove it. You do not know how to disprove this. Therefore, it is true. You can't disprove it, therefore you did commit the murder. That is argumentum ad ignorantiam. The structure of that would be, X is true. In this case, you committed a murder because you can't disprove it. It gets its name, the appeal to ignorance, because you are appealing to a person's ignorance, his inability to disprove something, his ignorance of how to disprove it, as the means of proving. Now you should be able to see easily enough that if this were permitted, the most bizarre fantasies would be established simply by virtue of the impossibility of refuting them if they're put forth arbitrarily. I can point to someone and say, I feel terribly sorry for you because of the awful disease which you have. And the person says, well, what do you mean? I've just been to a doctor and got a clean bill of health. And I say, yes, I know, but the terrible thing about this disease is it hasn't been discovered by medical science yet. The worst thing about it is you feel perfectly healthy and then you go just like that. Prove that you don't have that disease. Now, if I give you no argument as to why you do have it, it is impossible to prove that you do not have such a disease. It cannot be done. And I can multiply fantasies truly without end. I can say at the back of the room there is at present a green gremlin, taking notes, listening, swallowing tutti frutti ice cream. Prove that there isn't. You say you don't see it. I say this is very small gremlin. It's beyond the most powerful microscope, so you can't see it. You say, I don't want to hear anything. You say, it's an inaudible gremlin. You say to me, how do I know that it exists? And I say, I don't have any proof that he does exist, but you don't have any proof that he does not exist. Now prove that he doesn't. You cannot do it. If you then say, I can't disprove it, therefore there is a gremlin at the back of the room, that is argumentum ad ignorantiam. Now, some years ago, when I used to give the green gremlin example, I thought to myself, well, this is a little far-fetched, but it illustrates the point. Today, this is a naturalistic report of the method by which people argue with the profusion of claims for every kind of occult supernaturalist influence, parapsychology, poltergeists, demons, and a national wave of enthusiasm for exorcism and demonology and demoniacal possession, etc., all of which is in the same category as the gremlin, logically. Now, what is the essential error here? The first thing to observe is that it is impossible to disprove an arbitrary assertion that something exists. Let me repeat that. It is impossible to disprove an arbitrary assertion that something exists. Now, the assertion that something exists is called in logic a positive statement. A positive statement simply means the claim that something exists. The corresponding negative would be the statement that it does not exist. Now, the point to see here is that it is impossible to disprove an arbitrary positive statement. You cannot directly prove that X, whatever it is, doesn't exist unless evidence is put forth to prove that it does. Take the gremlin case. Suppose the following. The person puts forth evidence, no matter how lame, but he tries to put forth evidence. He says, well, look, can't you see that green shimmering in the air back there? That's my argument for the gremlin. Well, now he gives you something to go on. And you are then free to offer a different interpretation, and by that means to refute his statement. You refute it by showing that the evidence that he claims doesn't in fact prove it. So you say, for instance, well, the reason there's that shimmering is that there's a radiator there, and it's the heat waves. And the reason that it looks green is because the light bulbs have a greenish cast. And therefore I can explain the phenomenon without reference to the gremlin, and then I've refuted the gremlin. But I did not refute it directly. I did not prove there is no gremlin out of a void. I simply attached myself to the positive evidence that the person claimed and showed that it had been misinterpreted. And in that way, you can refute a statement. But if the person simply says, there is a gremlin, prove there isn't, without pointing to any facts in support of his statement, what he is saying is, give me positive evidence of the non-existence of the gremlin. Give me positive data which follows from the non-existence of the gremlin. Now that is an assignment which cannot be fulfilled. It cannot be fulfilled for the most fundamental metaphysical reason, that if the gremlin doesn't exist, it's nothing, completely nothing, zero. And as such, it has no special effects, no consequences. It doesn't give off any negative aura. It doesn't give off any signs. There are no results in reality of a non-gremlin. You couldn't point to a certain set of facts and say, these are the consequences of the absence of gremlins. Nothing is nothing. And that's all you can say. If it's not there, it's not there. Now, in such a case, what then would be evidence of the non-gremlin? There is no positive evidence of the non-gremlin. The total absence of evidence for the gremlin is all that is required to say that it doesn't exist. The absence of any evidence for the gremlin is sufficient to justify the statement there is no gremlin. Now, if you understand this, you will understand the central principle that is involved in not committing this fallacy. That is known as the onus of proof principle. And it states, the onus of proof is on him who asserts the positive. The onus of proof is on him who asserts the positive. Now, by positive in this statement, we are speaking logically in terms of the content of the meaning of the statement, not grammatically. For instance, the statement, he is innocent, and the statement, he is guilty, are both grammatical positives. And yet, obviously, of those two, which is the one that claims something happened, and which is the one that claims it did not happen? The statement, he is guilty, is the positive in this connection. He did commit a certain crime. The statement, he is innocent, is the negative. It is the statement, he did not commit this particular crime. So you have to go by the meaning, not by the formal grammatical structure, which may not indicate it. But if you understand the correct meaning of the term positive in this connection, the onus of proof principle says the onus of proof is on him who asserts the positive. In other words, suppose you have two statements competing for your allegiance. One is a positive, X exists. The other is the corresponding negative, X does not exist. According to the onus of proof principle, these two statements are in different epistemological categories or statuses. The same methods are not required to establish both of them. If the person, you see, the idea is the burden, the responsibility of proof is on the side of the positive. If a person puts forth evidence for the positive, then you either agree with his evidence and accept his conclusion, or it's your obligation to refute his evidence. Show that he's misinterpreted his claim, and then you can have dismissed his point. But if he does not put evidence forth for his conclusion, he simply asserts a positive as an arbitrary utterance, then according to the onus of proof principle, the negative in such a case holds the field, and you have no obligation to prove the negative, and in fact there is, as I tried to show you, no possibility to prove a negative, because that would involve refuting an arbitrary positive which cannot be done. The only proof for a negative that you can ask is the complete absence of proof for the positive. That is all that is required to validate the negative. It is not your obligation, and there is no possibility of providing a positive proof of a negative in this connection. And this is the reason why ignorantiam is a fallacy. Ignorantiam says, disprove an arbitrary positive, and then it says, since you can't disprove it, it must be true. Whereas, in fact, according to the onus of proof principle, if there is no evidence for the positive, it is disqualified on that grounds alone. Now, I'd like to point out before we leave ignorantiam that this applies, all the points we've made apply just as much to statements about what is possible as it does to statements about what is actual. Now, there's a certain type of person who would say, well, of course, just because she can't disprove that she committed the murder, we can't say, therefore, she did. So this type of person, you can call them the agnostic mentality, will say, well, you can't prove that she did, and she can prove that she didn't, and therefore the only proper conclusion to come to is maybe she committed it. It's possible she committed a gory murder. She can't disprove it, you can't prove it, therefore our compromise conclusion is it's possible. She might use the word possible or say maybe, it might happen, perhaps, or any equivalent. Now I want to point out to you that that is the same fallacy, but now transferred from the plane of actuality, whether it did or didn't happen, to the plane of possibility. Might it or might it not have happened? To assert that something is possible, that maybe it will take place, requires evidence and proof also. If you argue you can't prove it's impossible, therefore it's possible, you are committing ignorantiam, exactly the same fallacy, only now you're doing it on the level of possibility. It is not true that anything is possible, and in this issue, as in the earlier discussion, the onus of proof is on he who asserts the positive. If there is no evidence whatever of any kind to indicate that a certain phenomenon is possible, you are entitled without argument to say it is not possible. You're entitled to say, since there is no evidence for its possibility, the negative holds the field. Now this perhaps be a little clearer if you consider what does it mean to say that such and such an affair is possible. It's possible that it occurred. It might have taken place. If you think about it, you'll see that possible means a certain position on the scale of evidence. There's a whole continuum ranging around three central positions. On the one hand, there's the position when you have some evidence in favor of a conclusion. Not much, but some real specific evidence bearing on your particular conclusion. Now it's in that case that you are entitled to say it is possible. Then, as the evidence increases, at a certain point, the preponderance of the evidence, the weight of the evidence, the overall thrust points in a certain direction, and now you can go one step further and say it's not only possible, it is probable. And then, of course, if the totality of the evidence, without exception, points to a certain conclusion, and there's nothing pointing in any other direction, you are entitled to say it is certain. But the relevant point is the claim of possibility is a point on that scale and must be justified by some evidence. Not a great deal, but some. Now, for instance, I cannot look at this lady and say, it's possible you committed a murder. Out of the blue, I am simply, that is a crude, arbitrary declaration without basis or justification. But suppose, I can say just schematically this much. Well, she was in town at the time the murder was committed. The murder was done by a gun, and she has a gun. And she knew the victim. And I think she even disliked the victim. And a few pieces of information like that is not much of a case. But it's enough for a detective to say, well, that's a possibility we have to run down. But notice that the proper detective does not turn through the phone book, pick at any point in random and say, well, everything is possible. Maybe Mr. Smith did it, and therefore go out. You couldn't begin to get off the ground by that method. You need some evidence to say it's possible. Then, of course, assuming that more evidence comes in, that she was seen in the neighborhood at the time of the crime, and she expressed violent anger toward the victim, the serial number of the gun matches, and so on, and then it begins to get more and more probable. And at a certain point, let us say there was a convention in the next room and they were photographing it secretly, it becomes certain. The relevant point is, it is not true that anything is possible. The onus of proof is on he who asserts the positive. So in this case, you are logically required to say, on the basis of the evidence available to us now, there is no possibility that she committed this murder on the basis of this evidence. Now you can look at the point like this, taking that same example. Prior to my coming along, you all lived your life and did your thinking without taking into account the idea. Maybe she committed the murder, maybe there's a gremlin in the back of the room, maybe you're dying of a terminal disease, etc. Now you were perfectly rational not to take into account any of those claims because you had been given no evidence whatever to consider it. The only thing that has changed from your original position when you entered the room is that I have made arbitrary, baseless claims. And the key thing is, an arbitrary claim does not constitute an evidence or argument. Epistemologically, you are in the same position now in connection with the gremlin or that undiscovered disease or her murder that you were when you came in. There is absolutely no grounds for you to raise it. My arbitrary assertion is worth nothing as far as knowledge is concerned. You have to treat an arbitrary assertion as though you are deaf. Or another, putting it a little more accurately, as though the person is simply babbling. He's simply making nonsense syllables. Consequently, it is not up to you to alter your epistemological state, your cognitive content, in any form on the basis of somebody else's arbitrary claims. Therefore, I say, as a kind of moral from this, be very wary of any questions which begin, how do you know that such and such is not the case? Any question of that structure is an open invitation to commit ignorantiam. How do you know that you're not dreaming? Descartes asked, for instance. How do you know you're not insane? Or the switch from Descartes. How do you know the Russians did not have a change of heart and are now really peace-loving? How do you know there isn't a devil that possesses people in Southern California periodically? How do you know there isn't life on Mars, etc.? All of those questions are invalid at the outset. They are all appeals to ignorance. They are all demands that you show that something is not the case. And the only proper answer is, the onus of proof is on him who asserts the positive. What makes you think it is so? And if you can't say any reason why it is so, there is no obligation on anybody's part or possibility to establish that it isn't so. Now you'll see that that is a subtle fallacy, very widespread. All right, let us look now at, what is this, 9? Now 9 has an impressive Latin name and a common English name, and you can use either. In Latin, it is petitio principii. Petitio. And then, second word, principii. which translates into the English term begging the question. This one you can refer to familiarly as a petitio. You say about somebody, he commits a petitio. That's all you have to say. In other words, you don't have to go through the whole Latin speech. This is a very common and very important fallacy. In essence, it is simply the fallacy of using or assuming the point you are trying to prove as part of your proof. Using what you're trying to prove. Using or assuming what you're trying to prove as part of your proof. Now, in any valid proof, the premises must be distinct from the conclusion. It must be possible to establish the premises without establishing the conclusion. For instance, if I say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. My conclusion is Socrates is mortal. Now, the statement all men are mortal can be established entirely independently of Socrates. It would be true even if there never had been a Socrates. The statement Socrates is a man can be established independently of his mortality from the nature of what a man is. Neither of those statements assume in advance that Socrates is mortal. They are distinct from the conclusion. And then by combining the two, we can draw the conclusion. That is the proper method of proof. But suppose I said, all men are mortal. Socrates is mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That would be a petitio. That would be begging the question. And you would see that it would be obviously a useless, wasted, pointless procedure. If something requires proof, it's useless to assume it in advance as part of your proof. And if it doesn't require proof, then there's no point in giving a proof. To beg the question is to assume you already know, in advance of your proof, the very thing you claim to be trying to establish. And if we wanted to give it a structure, therefore, a formal structure, it would be X is true, therefore X is true. Now, sometimes this fallacy is committed in a generalized form, and there's nothing you can say about the example except you're assuming the point at issue. You're accepting in advance of your proof the very thing in debate. And that's all you can say in certain cases of this fallacy. But in a number of cases, logicians have defined recognized subforms of begging the question, and I will give you 4 such forms. Because in the ordinary case, the person doesn't say, P is true, therefore P is true, or X is true, therefore X is true, because it's too blatantly illogical. So it's disguised in various ways. And here are 4 particular forms, all forms of petitio, of begging the question. The simplest is restatement. In this version, you restate the thesis you're trying to prove. Almost always you use different language, and that's what disguises from the person that he is simply restating. For instance, here's an example. Capital punishment for murderers is justified. That's what he's trying to prove. Because there are good reasons to put to death people who have committed murder. Now, there are good reasons to put to death people who have committed murder is a way of saying what? What is the content? Capital punishment is justified. And therefore, this example reduces to capital punishment is justified because it is. That's all. It's a restatement. Here's one I copied down from one book. The young will necessarily abstain from vice if the consequences are pointed out to them. Why? Because a knowledge of those consequences cannot fail to deter them from committing vicious acts. And knowledge will deter them because a knowledge will deter them. Here's one. Vivisection is wrong because the cutting up of animals for experimental purposes is wicked. That's another way of saying vivisection is wrong. It's right to give money to beggars. Why? Because it's your moral duty. Another way of saying it's right. Now, perhaps the clearest way to see this, students have an enormous tendency to commit this particularly if they're new to philosophy and they're not clear what a proof consists of, they will try to prove free will, for instance. And they will say, obviously man has free will. My proof is that he's not determined. So, another way of saying it, what's the proof that he's not determined? Well, obviously he's not determined, he's got choice. And they'll just say it over and over again. And the best way to illustrate this is I say, well, now look, suppose you come to contest your grade and I gave you an F, which is a failure. And you say to me, that isn't a fair grade. Defend that grade. And I say, well, obviously you failed. You didn't pass. And he says, well, but you're just saying the same. No, I say, well, obviously you didn't pass. You didn't get A, B, C, or D. Now, I can say that in linguistically a whole variety of forms, but I'm still simply assuming the point at issue, in this case by simple restatement. Now, a second form of petitio is the form often called arbitrary definition. Petitio via arbitrary definition. In this case, it's still begging the question. You're assuming the thing you're supposed to be proving. But it takes the form of arbitrarily redefining some key term in the argument in accordance with the thesis at issue in order to make the position impregnable. The person, normally in this form, puts forth some statement. Somebody else points out a counter-example. The original person immediately switches one of his definitions in order to save himself from the objection. And when you ask him, how do you justify that definition, he recites his original thesis, the very point which is in dispute. For instance, somebody comes in and says, I give you a simplified example. There are some more real-life examples in the homework booklet. But a simple example. Somebody comes in and says, I have a new view. All Christians are virtuous. And you say to him, well, what about Mr. Jones? He's a member of such and such Christian denomination, but he's deeply involved in the manufacture of LSD and runs the mafia in his neighborhood, and 7 or 8 houses of ill repute, etc. Doesn't that refute your thesis that all Christians are virtuous? He says, not at all. Mr. Jones isn't a Christian. Say, well, why isn't he a Christian? Is it because he's not virtuous? Obviously, to be a Christian, you have to be virtuous. Say, why? How do you justify that definition, which equates Christian with being virtuous? Well, that definition must be justified because all Christians are virtuous. In other words, he ends up stating the very point at issue and uses it to insinuate an arbitrary redefinition. When you first heard the statement, you thought he meant by Christian any member of a certain denomination. You now find that under the pressure of assuming his thesis, he has redefined it in order to make his thesis impregnable. Another simple example. All students enrolled in this course are brilliant. Somebody says, well, what about Mr. X, who doesn't seem to know what's going on at all and makes all kinds of mistakes, etc. You say, oh, he's not a true student. Why not? Because if he were a true student, he would be brilliant. Well, why would he be? Because all students are brilliant. That's circularity via, in this case, redefining what a true student is. Now, I'd like to point out to you that if your definition is not arbitrary, there is nothing wrong. Repeat that. There is nothing wrong with appealing to definitions to validate your view, if your definition itself is justified, and that we will discuss the rules for that later in the course. If I say, for instance, all triangles are three-sided, and somebody points to a square and says, well, what about that? It's not three-sided. And I say, of course not, it isn't a triangle because all triangles are three-sided. That is not begging the question on my part. That is not a petitio, because my original definition of triangle was not arbitrary. It was defensible. But what makes it begging the question is when you start with the normal definition as a virtuous or student in the 2 examples I mentioned, and then arbitrarily change it because you are assuming without proof your original thesis. That is begging the question. Now, I'd like also to point out, well, just before we leave this form, it is not true that any invalid definition or any arbitrary definition is begging the question. There's all sorts of bad definitions which do not commit the fallacy of begging the question. It's begging the question when the cause of the arbitrary definition is assuming the very point at issue, because the essence of begging the question is assuming what you're supposed to be proving. All right, a third form of begging the question, or petitio, is known as circular reasoning. Now, sometimes the word circular reasoning is used simply synonymously with begging the question, but there is a specific version of begging the question which is commonly the phrase circular reasoning is reserved for. And this is obviously reasoning in a circle. In this case, you don't restate, you don't arbitrarily redefine, you have a series of propositions. You use A to prove B, B to prove C, C to prove D, and then say D to prove A. So by a number of intermediate links, you are using A to prove A. At minimum, you have to have one link to make it a circle, and sometimes there's a great many. Here is one, for instance, I copied from one book. Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, said that he could be trusted when he asserted that he was God's true prophet. When asked for proof, he answered that the Book of the Mormon said that he was the true prophet. When asked for proof that we could rely on the Book of the Mormon, he asserted that it was the Word of God. When asked for proof that it was the Word of God, he assured us that he believed it was, and that after all, he was God's true prophet. Now that obviously is a circular and completely wasted procedure. I think the classic example they tell introductory logic classes is the two people come into the bank for a loan, and the banker says to the one who wants the loan, I'd be perfectly happy to loan you the money, but I don't know you, or therefore whether you are reliable. And the person said, well, I foresaw that contingency, and that's why I brought my friend, who has known me for a long time and who will vouch for me. And the banker says, well, that would be terrific, except I don't know your friend. And the original guy says, well, that's okay. I've known him for years, and I'll vouch for him. Now, that is circular reasoning, because if you put it, the structure of it would be, I am reliable, therefore he is reliable, therefore I am reliable. He's using his reliability to prove his reliability through one intermediate link. Now, we have one or two examples of that form on the sheet also, in the booklet. All right, let's look finally at a fourth common version of begging the question, and that is simply what's called a question-begging epithet. A question-begging epithet. Now, in this case, you don't give a complete argument, as in the preceding forms. You simply use an expression. An epithet means a word or combination of words. You use an expression in advance of a proof, which assumes that you've already proven the point at issue when you haven't. If you use such an expression in advance, it is called a question-begging epithet. An epithet or expression which assumes the point at issue. For instance, a lawyer is at a trial, and the question is this man guilty of a certain crime or not? And the prosecutor during the trial, before any verdict is in or the evidence is put forth, says, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I will show you that on January such and such, this killer entered the room and did such and such. Well, by calling the man a killer, at that point in time, prior to giving any proof, he is assuming the very point at issue. He is using a question-begging epithet. Or you want to show an audience that a certain viewpoint is wrong, a certain policy is mistaken. And you say to your audience, all right, I am now going to show you that this depraved, monstrous policy is wrong. Well, that depraved and monstrous in that context is a question-begging epithet because it assumes the point at issue. Of course, after you've given the proof and assuming it's valid, it's perfectly all right to say the man is a killer or the policy is monstrous. But if you do it before, you are assuming what you're supposed to be proving. Now, begging the question is a very common fallacy and a subtle one. Because if you hold a belief sincerely, it has a tendency to become a part of your thinking. And you're prone, many people are prone, especially in the face of objections, to simply restate their belief, which seems obvious, or to assume it rather than to prove it. The only way out of this fallacy is to be sure that you can prove each of your conclusions from premises that are in fact independent of the conclusion. Now let us look at one last fallacy tonight, a very brief, obvious one, which is also essentially an issue of making unwarranted assumptions, but somewhat different in character from Petidio. And this is a fallacy which is interchangeably called by logicians by three different names. It's sometimes called complex question, which is the term I'll use. It's also called leading question. It's also called loaded question. Now, as the name would suggest, it always manifests itself in the asking of a question. What makes it a fallacy, or what does it consist of? Well, in this case, you assume some fact without warrant or proof, and then you ask a question on the basis of it. That is the commonest form of this complex question fallacy. Your question is complex because there really are two separate issues which you have lumped together into one. You have snuck in an assumption without discussion, which is the presupposition of your question. Now, the classic example used in the Greek world to illustrate this is, and you must have heard it, have you stopped beating your wife? A complex question, if ever there was one, because to which there's no out. If you say yes, the implication is you were beating her, but you stopped. And if you say no, the implication is you're still beating her. And obviously what makes that question hopeless to ask, to try to answer, is that it's based on the assumption you were beating your wife at one point. And if that is unjustified, the whole question collapses. Now, there's all sorts of examples to this fallacy. Lawyers frequently use it deliberately in order to trap somebody into an admission. So if a defendant has pleaded not guilty, they don't say to him, did you commit this crime, but for instance, where did you hide the goods? You see, where the where changes the issue from did you to where did you. We just take for granted that you did. That's a complex question. Agitators frequently slip in their assumptions by this means. Why should we continue to be exploited by the greedy capitalists? Now that, of course, takes as an assumption that you are being exploited, and the question is only why. Charles II, so I read, puzzled the Royal Society for a long time of Britain with the question, why is it that if you put a live fish in a basin filled with water, it does not overflow, but when you put a dead one in, it does? Why does that happen? And of course they expended a great deal of effort on why it happens, and he enlightened them finally that it doesn't happen. Now there's all sorts of studies and surveys and research projects put out and financed by universities, foundations, the Ford Foundation, etc., the entire project of which is a complex question, such as, what is the mechanism by which TV violence produces depravity in children? Not does it, but what is the mechanism by which it does? That is a complex question. Now, the two most obvious philosophic examples of this are, one, who created the universe? As though, well, it's obvious somebody created the universe, and it's only a question whether it's God or my mother-in-law or somebody else. Now, that is a complex question. You first would have to establish, which you wouldn't be able to do, that the universe was created, that there was a time when it didn't exist, and then if you were able to establish that, you could go on and say, and who was it that did it? The other obvious philosophic example of this is the individual that you argue about free will versus determinism. Suppose you've given a proof of free will, which I'm not going to recapitulate at this moment, but suppose. And he says, fine, and you've convinced him that man has one basic act of direct free choice, and that is to think or not. And he says, okay, I agree with your proof and so on. But the question is, what made this individual at a given moment think or not? You say to him, well, what do you mean, what made him think? If you mean what factor outside of his choice operated upon him to necessitate that he make this choice, the answer is no such factor, because that's the whole meaning of free will, that you have the choice as simply a function of your volition, not as a product necessitated from the outside. But of course there are many determinists who will slip in the determinist premise that everything is necessitated by previous factors and couldn't have been different. But instead of stating that openly, we'll simply say, well, but what made him do it? As though that is a valid question, when if you've in fact proved free will, that is a complex and unwarranted question. Now there are other forms of complex question. For instance, to ask two different questions, a compound question, together and demand a single answer. There you're slipping in the assumption that the answer to both is the same. Do you admire upstanding religious men? Yes or no? Well, you might say, yes, I admire upstanding men. No, I don't admire religious men, you might say, depending on your view. Do you want to be progressive and socialistic? You might say, yes, I want to be progressive. No, I don't want to be socialistic. Are you for the Democrats and prosperity? You might say no and yes. Parents often pull this one on their children. Do you want to be a good boy and go to bed? Now, if he knew any introductory logic, he'd simply say complex question. Yes, I want to be a good boy. No, I don't want to go to bed. Now, you can multiply this yourself. Is he a screwball extremist? Yes, he's an extremist, etc. Is he an unthinking conservative? And so on. The moral of this is do not lump different things together. If you're confronted by a question, distinguish its components and identify its assumptions, and attend to each ingredient separately. All right, we've done 10 this evening, and I won't take up any more tonight. We have about a dozen more for next week. Now, before we take a minute or so break, do you want to take that booklet that you collected at the beginning here this evening, and let me assign certain ones to do, which we will take up next week. Now you will notice that this booklet has two parts. Beginning on page 14 is simply illustrative material that I will be referring to during the lecture portions of various lectures. And so you can ignore that part altogether for now. Turn instead to the very beginning, which would be page 1, the section entitled Informal Fallacies. Now, I will now read for you, once only, I won't take the time to repeat it, the numbers you should now be able to do. And all you have to do is check it or circle it in some way. And the only thing to do is, before next week, go over, it's comparatively easy because you only have 10 to choose from now, not 22 or so as you'll have next week. State which one it is, and be prepared to say in a phrase, in a terse, brief, a half-sentence comment, why you think it's that fallacy, and we'll take these up next week. Here are the ones. As I say, I'll repeat it once only. Number 1. These are the exercises beginning on page 1, and I'll give you the ones you can do. Number 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, 9, 13, 14, 15, 16, 18, 24, 25, 26, 29, 33, 34, 35, 37, 40, 43, 44, 45, 46, 49, 57, 58, and 60. Those are the ones that you are now equipped to identify, and we will take those up during the question period next week. All right, let us take a break for a minute or two and let the commuters leave, and then we will turn to questions. Thank you. I have a whole variety of written questions here, so let me try and make a dent in them before taking some from the floor. Since man's mind is fallible, how can he be sure of the truth of any conclusion he has reached? That is one of the examples on the exercise list, so I'll pass it by now. That has been assigned for homework, almost in those words, as to what is the fallacy involved. So let's leave it, and we'll take that up next week. What is the distinction between a contradiction and a paradox? A paradox is an apparent contradiction, not a real one. A paradox is simply a situation where it seems as though a contradiction is correct. But in fact, when you resolve the paradox, you see that there is no contradiction. So a paradox simply means the appearance of a contradiction, whereas an actual contradiction would be the reality of it. Another one. At the end of an argument concerning the existence or non-existence of God, I invariably sum up my position by saying just because you do not know where the world, the universe, etc. originated, there is no reason to assume that it must have been started by a God. The other person just as invariably comes back with, then where did it come from? At that point I am forced to concede that I don't know the answer. Is there a logical answer for such a mystic? Yes. The question, where did the universe come from, is a perfect example of what fallacy? Complex question. Right. The universe means the totality of that which exists. Doesn't mean just the Earth or the solar system or this galaxy, but everything, the totality. Now, by the very definition of universe, it cannot come from anywhere. There is nothing apart from the universe. The alternative to the universe is nothing. That's the only thing that's left when you have taken away the totality of that which is. And nothing is nothing. It is not a breeding ground for something, and it does not produce something. Therefore, the philosophic axiom has to be, what exists, exists. That, of course, is the meaning of existence exists. It is a primary. You cannot get beneath it, around it, underneath it, behind it, and find something earlier from which it came. It simply is. It is eternal. There was never a point at which it began, and never a point will come at which it disappears. Existence is the axiom. What is, is. Now, it should be clear to you that even suppose, contrary to all logic, you were to say, oh, well, I found this fantastic entity, God or whatever you call him. That is the creator of the universe. Now that's where it comes from. If you're going to take that approach, you haven't satisfied anything, because the immediate next question is, well, suppose there was a God who created the universe. Where did he come from? Now then you'll be forced either to say, well, there's a super God that created God and a super God that created him, and you'll have a whole infinite regress. Or you will say, as most people say when confronted with that question, well, what do you mean? You have to start somewhere. Something simply always existed, which is correct. Something simply is. It has no deeper explanation. It's the primary. And here your choice is. Do you take as your primary existence, or do you take as your primary some consciousness which is supposed to precede and control existence? And that is determined by your metaphysics. If you are on the premise of the primacy of existence, that existence comes first, you won't have any difficulty at all in saying existence exists, that's the primary, and it's not incumbent upon me to discuss where it came from. When will you be inclined to be satisfied with the existence of God as the explanation? If you are deeply on the primacy of consciousness metaphysics, then it will seem to you sensible and natural that of course a gigantic consciousness came first. You have to start with something, but as long as it's consciousness, then that makes sense and fits in with my metaphysics and doesn't bother me. So this is a question of your fundamental metaphysics. Now obviously objectivism holds that existence is the primary, not consciousness, and consequently dismisses out of hand the question, where did the universe come from? It's not that we do not know where it came from, as that question implied. The concept of the universe coming from anything or anywhere is a self-contradiction on its face. In her writings, Maria Montessori reveals herself as a mystic in part, and there's a quotation here about God being the grantor of our gifts. Therefore, how do you account for such a logically derived method of education? 2 quick points on that question. The belief in God is not as such synonymous with mysticism. If a person believes they can argue for the existence of God, then objectivism holds that as a mistake, but it does not yet necessarily mean the person is a mystic. It may be simply an error of knowledge, as, for instance, was the case with Thomas Aquinas. A mystic is a person who believes something arbitrarily on the basis of feelings. And I do not know that Maria Montessori believed in God that way. In fact, I have the vaguest overtone of an association that she was some kind of Thomist. I'm not sure that that's true, but in any event, the assumption of the question is invalid. But now, second, suppose that she had terrible views on many questions. It is possible for people to hold contradictions. Therefore, it is not a puzzle. How can a person hold some very good ideas and some very bad ideas? It is possible because people do not hold consistent philosophies, do not apply them all the way down, and also are capable of error. And consequently, there's no special puzzle about a person who holds certain views which are wrong and others which are right. This one I want to comment on very briefly. What difference does it make if the facts of the universe exist independent of mine, when I cannot be sure that my perceptions of the universe are correct? Well, if you couldn't be sure that your perceptions are correct, it wouldn't make any difference. Nothing would make any difference to you in such a case, because if you are not sure of your perceptions, you are not conscious. You are an automaton, devoid of consciousness in the most literal sense, in which case, whatever this is marks on paper, but it's not the questions of a conscious being. Now, I'm not getting involved in a whole discussion of the validity of the senses, which could take hours and hours. But I put to you very briefly this simple fact. Consciousness is consciousness of something. There's nothing to be conscious of but existence. The primary form in which human beings come into contact with existence is their senses. If you say the senses aren't valid, or you're not sure whether they're valid, you're saying that in our primary act of consciousness we are not aware of existence, or you don't know that you're aware of existence. In which case there's nothing else to be aware of. If your senses aren't valid, completely, 100% valid, then you have no basis whatever in which to say that you are conscious of anything, because all your higher conceptual conclusions are built on and derivatives from the direct evidence of the senses. If the senses aren't valid, you have no faculty for perceiving reality. If you don't, you are unconscious. Now, of course, there's 1,000 arguments raised against the senses. All of them are invalid. I wouldn't know even where to begin to start on an extemporaneous discussion of it, but I just simply conclude with this point. By sensory evidence here, we mean only what is directly fed to you by the physical mechanism of your consciousness, not the interpretation you place on it. You can make mistakes in interpreting, in classifying, in conceptualizing your sensory data. But the sheer raw data, the concept of a mistake or an error or a deception is simply impossible. The eye doesn't say to you that the rails are bent when you look in the distance. The eye simply gives you the effect of certain causes. Then it's up to you to interpret. There's no way that can be distorted. You perceive something. It has to be there. You have to perceive the facts because there's nothing else to perceive. If you don't know that, you don't know whether you're conscious, in which case there can be no further discussion. In what sense is subjectivism an example of the stolen concept fallacy? Well, I assume this is referring to last week's discussion. I didn't make the point that subjectivism as such was an example of the stolen concept fallacy, although you could make that point too. I made the point that anybody who claims to argue for a subjectivist view is engaged in a stolen concept fallacy, because argument presupposes logic and the law of identity, which the subjectivist openly attacks, and therefore he is counting on logic to form the concept of argument in order then to use it to attack the root on which it depends. And in that sense, he is committing the stolen concept fallacy. You could, however, go on to make the further point that any attack on reality is a stolen concept because the concept of existence is the precondition of all other concepts. Until you know that something is, you cannot reach the conceptual level. You cannot begin to say what something is until you know that it is, that there is an existence, that there is something there. Now, the subjectivist actually launches an attack on existence as such by means of denying the law of identity. You understand why. Existence means identity. To be is to be something. The person who denies identity is denying existence. By that fact, he has made his entire conceptual framework a stolen concept. It's like conceptual grand larceny of the most momentous dimensions, because he's not entitled to any concepts then, once the concept of existence has been denied. How can I be sure that I have not made an error in logic when trying to arrive at a true statement? Now, what fallacy does that question smack of? How do you know you didn't make an error? Now, that altogether depends. Did you wake up in a kind of, I don't mean this personally, but abstractly, did the person wake up in a kind of alcoholic stupor and go through two kind of ritualistic routine steps and say, therefore, Hitler was the greatest man in history? And how do you know you didn't make an error? Well, if you approach it that way, you don't know that you didn't make an error because the whole thing was out of focus to begin with. But assuming you have within the knowledge available to you defined the terms, stated the fact it's based on, spelled out the steps of the reasoning, and so on, and focused and concentrated, you can present all your arguments. And all the other side has to say is, how do you know you didn't make an error? That is ignorantiam. And the answer there is the onus of proof is on he who asserts that you did make an error. All the evidence in this case is you have a valid conclusion. If somebody asserts even the possibility of the opposite, he has to give an argument for that. He has to base it on something. Now that already verges on the first question, which I put off for next week because it's one of the fallacies, so I don't want to give you any more blatant clues than that I already have. Take a look at some of these later questions to see if what is the difference between metaphysical and ontological. For practical purposes, in this course, they would be used synonymously. If it's very long, I'll have to take it home because I don't have time. Well, that one I've covered essentially. Yeah, I pointed out that complex question is used frequently by lawyers in questioning defendants or witnesses. In that particular context, is it ever appropriate to use this or any other fallacy to question a defendant or a witness? Well, it depends what you mean by appropriate. It is never an exercise in logic to commit a fallacy. But I can conceive of situations where you do it to in effect, in self-defense, to trap someone whom you have reason to believe is lying. And in that connection, you might do it. But that doesn't mean that, for instance, if you have strong reason to believe that this witness has hidden the evidence, and he denies it vociferously, you might try to ask such a question, but of course if the opposing lawyer will jump up right away and declare that it's invalid, and if the witness has 2 cents worth of logical acumen, he will do it too, so I don't know what it will get you. I would not say it is always wrong. And for instance, if you are caught in the hands of a maniac, or anyone who wants to use force against you, you can do anything in the world that you think might get you out. You are morally entitled to do anything. If he happens to have a fixation on gremlins, and you tell him there's a gremlin in the next room,
And if he just simply goes to visit it, he'll become the Messiah of the universe. And then you take that opportunity to escape, well, there's no question there of giving a logical argument. You're trying to save your life. The only error would be if you think to yourself, well, this makes ignorantiam or whichever valid. It's not valid, but all's fair when somebody's trying to kill you. So in that connection, what is the difference between fact and opinion? Well, they're used in many different ways, but as I use it, an opinion is simply a belief which you cannot prove, which you cannot establish. A fact is an aspect of existence which is there independent of anybody's beliefs. So opinion comes in the general field of epistemology. And it stands for an idea which doesn't have a basis, as I use the term. Simply a belief. And I would contrast opinion with conviction, namely an idea that you have that you think you can give an argument or grounds for. Now, fact, on the other hand, is metaphysical and pertains to what's out there in reality. If it's a fact no matter who thinks what. Do you distinguish between proof and validation? And if so, how? Yes. Validation, I would say, is the broader term. Validation is the process of establishing the correspondence between an idea and reality. In other words, of showing that an idea is based on reality. Now, this does not always involve proof, which is a subcategory within the broader concept of validation. For instance, you validate axioms, but you do not prove them. In connection with the law of identity, as we said last time, you can't give a proof of the law. But what you can do is define what is meant by self-evident, show in what way the law of identity is self-evident, show that it must be used even to be denied, go through the reaffirmation through denial point, etc. Now, all of that together constitutes a validation. It shows that it's ridiculous to say the law of identity is arbitrary or baseless or false, but it is not a proof in the sense of a deduction or inductive derivation from preceding premises. In that sense, I would say validation is the wider category. If you try to stir up emotion in one person to get him to believe in something, is that argumentum ad populum? Yes. In other words, it does not have to be a crowd of people, even though that's the official definition of the word populum was derived from that. But it's the same fallacy if you play on one other person's emotion. Read the appeal to pity being used to excuse a criminal because he had a bad childhood. Couldn't this be determinism and not the appeal to pity? Well, of course, that's characteristically determinism. He had no chance. But the idea is that in those cases that I was mentioning, the person uses determinism as a means to invoke pity. The idea is he couldn't help himself and therefore feel sorry for him and therefore ignore the facts of what he's done. So determinism, in the cases I mentioned, becomes the vehicle to smooth the way for the appeal to pity. Regarding your explanation of why verecundiam is wrong, if people were usually logical, would the fact that most people believe something be evidence that it's true? No. Even there, it would not be evidence that it's true. But it depends what you mean. If people were usually logical. In no society, including Atlantis or the perfect world as you imagine it, would anybody automatically and infallibly be logical. In no society would it be impossible for people to come to a mistaken view, a false view, a view that departs from the facts, and to have it widely shared. That could be owing to all sorts of factors, the fact that people always have free will, the fact that a situation is very complicated. And therefore, even if people were generally logical and we had a better society, it would not follow that the fact that everybody believes it is evidence that it's true. All it would mean is you'd be more interested in trying to see what did they believe and why on the grounds that their general batting average is better. They're generally more pro-logic, and therefore if a view is widespread, you wouldn't, as you would in a society which is collapsing epistemologically and otherwise like today. I've heard people say if the view is widespread, it must be wrong. Well, you wouldn't have, you see, that element if you had a healthier society, but it still would be not correct to say if the majority of people had held it, there must be something to it, because they would always be susceptible to errors. And I gather at the rate that these are coming in, there's a preference for written questions. I'm trying to get the ones that pertain more specifically to this course. Oh, I had some left from last week, so let me look at those briefly. One thing I want to correct, some student pointed out last time, that there was a lot of problems on certain people's part about the definition of logic as the art of non-contradictory identification. And he pointed out, I think correctly, that perhaps the confusion was that people thought the word art was used in the sense in which you speak of fine art. So that they thought I was saying there's music and painting and sculpture and architecture and logic as one of the arts, and that was baffling. Now, obviously, if you took art in that sense, logic is not an art. I want to just point out that the term art is used in many senses. In its narrowest sense, it's used for painting as against the other fine arts. You speak of art and music and literature. Then in the next level, you use art synonymous with fine art, where it includes all of the things we call the fine arts that I've just mentioned. But I was using it in a much broader sense, where you speak of the art of weaving, the art of tying a shoelace, the art of cooking, etc. Now, in that sense, you simply mean a skill or technique proceeding according to certain rules to achieve a certain practical end. And logic, in that broad sense, is an art, a practical art, a way or method of thinking according to certain rules. Maybe that will clarify that point. And I had one more, which was raised last week, and then I see that there was a close one like it, which I wanted to mention. Close one like it tonight. Is double negation a fallacy? I.e. the notion that A is not A. No, that is not a fallacy. There are even cases, as you'll see in working out arguments, where it is valid and necessary to reformulate a positive statement in terms of two negatives. There's nothing fallacious about that, and indeed, in a way, that is the statement of the law of contradiction. The law of identity says A is A. The law of contradiction says, well, it's not A. There's no fallacy in that. And then this question goes on. This is still from last week. Is not A, the phrase, not A, is that a characteristic or the absence of one? Well, of course, it altogether depends on the definition of A, which can vary from context to context. For instance, suppose A means spatially extended, spread out, like in 1 or 2 or 3 dimensions. Then not A would mean not spatially extended. For instance, the way a thought is not spatially extended, or a feeling, or a psychological phenomenon in general. In which case, not A means the absence of a certain characteristic. On the other hand, suppose A is defined negatively as unintelligent or not intelligent. That's what you mean by A. Then not A in that context would mean not non-intelligent, which would cancel each other out and come out as meaning intelligent. In other words, you can't answer the question except by reference to the specific definition that's used. All right, how about 1 or 2 from the floor? And I'll have to sort through these. Do I have any? All right, I'll continue on these then. There's some interesting questions, but I can't see that they are directly on logic, and since I have such a mass here, I'll try to avoid ethics and the history of philosophy. Do you draw any epistemological distinction between a thoroughly proved positive and a negative which you assume to be true, since the negative cannot be proved? If I understand you, and I'm not sure I do, but the meaning of this question would be, do you make a distinction between a positive for which you give a good solid proof and therefore you can say, I know it, as against a negative when there's no proof for the corresponding positive, about which you feel kind of tentative or hesitant or dubious, and you say, well, I don't know. I'm not sure that this is really true, but I just assume it. If that's the intent of the question, the answer is no, I don't make any such distinction. I am absolutely convinced, without qualm, hesitation, etc., that there's no gremlin at the back of this room that has no less certainty in my mind than that there is a table in this room. The method of those two are different. One rests on sense perception, and the other on the complete lack of evidence. But if there's an implication that negatives are tentative because they don't have some special proof, the presupposition of that question is, well, they ought to have some special proof in order to be firm. But you cannot say what ought to be if it is impossible. You cannot demand positive evidence of nothing. Now, perhaps what's in the back of the mind of the questioner is a situation like this, which is frequently raised in connection with ignorantiam. In fact, I had it in the lecture and took it out because there's no time. But I'll use the question period to sneak it in. You're often asked this question. Suppose in 1960, let us say, there is no evidence whatever for a certain phenomenon. And therefore, you see, the onus of proof is on the person who claims that phenomenon. There's no evidence. Therefore, I say no, it doesn't exist. And then in 1975, let us say, lo and behold, evidence for the phenomenon materializes for the first time. So now you say, well, after all, there is evidence. Therefore, the proposition exists. It is true. Isn't that a case where ignorantiam led you astray? Because when you followed the onus of proof principle, it led you to the falsehood. And my answer to that question is no. That is not a case where the onus of proof principle led you astray. That is simply an example of the fact, which is true of all knowledge, positive or negative, that human knowledge is contextual. It depends upon the evidence available at any given time. Every statement you make, leaving aside now the philosophic axioms which are the basis of any knowledge, but any other statement from the particular sciences or that depends upon particular studies, obviously is based on a certain context of evidence. You can't make any claim within the context of omniscience. So your statement always has to be understood as within the following context of evidence, within the evidence presently available. Here is my assessment. It's true, it isn't true. It's possible, it's probable, it's certain. Now take, for instance, the progression from possible to probable. Suppose you were a detective following that murder. When you said it's possible, and then next week you acquired more evidence and you said it's probable, did your statement that it's probable contradict your earlier statement that it's possible? No, because obviously your second statement was, in this context of evidence, the proper conclusion is it's probable. In the next context of evidence, the proper conclusion might be it's certain. Neither contradicts the preceding because the context of evidence available changes. Well, then, of course, the obvious question you'll ask is, well, but then how do you know? Suppose you have a case where there's no evidence for the thing at all, so you say it's out. Then you'll ask the question, but how do you know that evidence won't come up next year? To which I say, what? That is the fallacy of ignorantiam. The fact that in some cases in the past we have drawn a conclusion on limited evidence and then found later evidence does not prove that in this case there is even a possibility that it's going to happen. If you're going to say maybe we'll discover more evidence tomorrow, you're making a possibility statement, in which case you have to have some evidence. If you have no evidence whatever for the proposition, then the only thing you can validly say is there's no evidence for its truth. There's not even enough evidence to declare it possible. Therefore, taking everything into account, all the evidence available to me now, I say this proposition is out, it's false, it's not possible. And then somebody says, well, but how do you know it won't come tomorrow? I say, what's your evidence that it will? And if you can give evidence, okay. If not, not. See if we can take a couple of brief ones here. Yeah, it's the same question. Since a person might make an arbitrary statement, which later happens to prove to be true, how can one say that a wholly arbitrary statement is false? First of all, I did not say a wholly arbitrary statement is false. I said a wholly arbitrary statement is simply to be dismissed as though it has no content at all, as though the person simply thumbed his nose at you linguistically and didn't say anything, because that's what its evidential weight is. Now, if a person opens his mouth and utters an arbitrary statement, like take the one I gave in the lecture last week, that Golda Meir is playing darts with Moishe Dayan, and then I should find out after the lecture is over that there really was, by sheer chance, such a contest taking place, it's still the case that I was perfectly logical to say, on the basis of the evidence available to us at that time, it was a ridiculous invention and to be rejected. When further evidence comes in, if it comes in, then you say, not that I really grasped reality before, because it wasn't a grasp of reality, it was simply words that we retroactively call a grasp of reality because we have subsequently acquired information. But in that context of knowledge, it was wrong and remains wrong in that context of knowledge. Some of these I can't read the handwriting, so I will have to what hypothetically would constitute a proof of the existence of God? Well, I don't think you'll ever do it, because if it's going to be God, I mean, if you're going to use the word God to stand, for instance, for a tube of tobacco covered with white paper, then there's no difficulty proving it. Here's a whole collection of God. But if you're going to use the term God in its ordinary sense, that refers to a supernatural entity in conflict with the basic laws of nature, in which case you're never going to get any evidence from nature to support a construct of something which conflicts with it. So even hypothetically, I cannot imagine what would constitute, because you'd have to have a contradiction. You'd have to have evidence drawn from nature that proves a dimension which contradicts nature, which on the face of it is an impossibility. Is circularity, let's have to make this the last one because our time is up. Is circularity in a definition an example of begging the question? It is a related fallacy. He gives the example, a light fixture is a fixture for producing light. Obviously, that's a hopeless definition. That is called a circular definition. And it is the form in which, in the theory of definition, the equivalent of begging the question comes up, which we'll see as we get there. Let me see if I can sneak in one fast one. No, I can't. I'll search through and see what I can bring up for next week. Thank you very much.